Canada flips the switch on America's uranium flow.
94 U.S. reactors threatened. One premier holds the power.
Breaking news. Trade war meets nuclear risk. Canada's bluff or real weapon?
What if one phone call from Ontario could dim America's nuclear grid? That's not a movie plot. It's what Premier Doug Ford hinted when he warned that the U.S. is desperate for Canadian energy. 94 reactors across the United States rely on uranium that mostly comes from Canadian soil. So, when Ford threatened to cut it off after Trump escalated tariffs, it wasn't political theater. It was a reminder of just how fragile this alliance has become. It all started with a voice, not Doug Ford's, but Ronald Reagan's. Ontario's government aired a public service announcement last week using old Reagan audio clips warning against tariffs on foreign goods. It was meant as a subtle lesson in economic history, but Trump took it as a personal attack. Within hours, he canceled all trade talks with Canada and vowed to raise tariffs more than 10%. That's when Ford struck back, publicly and personally. He told reporters that if Trump wanted a trade war, he'd better be ready to lose power. Literally, the United States is desperate for our energy, he said. He was talking about uranium, potash, and critical minerals, the stuff that keeps everything from nuclear reactors to electric vehicles running. Canada provides about 24% of the world's uranium and around a quarter of U.S. imports. Most of it comes from Saskatchewan's Cigar Lake and McArthur River mines, run by Cameco, one of the largest uranium producers on Earth.
Now imagine that supply stopped. America's nuclear fleet, 94 reactors spread across 28 states, supplies roughly 1/5 of the nation's electricity. Many plants operate on tight fuel contracts that can't easily be replaced overnight. Russia and Kazakhstan still dominate global uranium production, but U.S. policy has moved to limit dependence on them since the Ukraine invasion. That means Canada, America's friendly neighbor, became the most trusted source left. So, what happens when that trust turns into leverage? Ford's statement wasn't just bluster. Canadian uranium exports to the U.S. were worth over $700 million last year. In 2024, according to Natural Resources Canada, uranium and potash were the two fastest-growing mineral export categories, largely because American utilities were stockpiling fuel amid uncertainty over Russia's supply. By contrast, Trump's tariffs, a 10% blanket on Canadian imports, hit auto parts, steel, and agriculture. Ottawa called them an economic self-harm. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce estimated that each percentage point of tariff could shave 0.1% off Canada's GDP and cost tens of thousands of jobs. But for Ford, this was personal. Ontario's manufacturing belt felt those losses first. That's why his counter-message hit so hard: energy as retaliation. The idea was simple. If Trump wants to weaponize trade, Canada can weaponize energy. And it was backed by facts from the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. Canadian uranium fuels nearly 1/3 of U.S. reactor capacity. Without it, fueling costs could skyrocket and utilities would have to source from higher-priced Kazakh suppliers, ironically through Russian channels. So yes, Canada can technically pull that lever, but should it?
In Washington, the Senate answered with a rare rebuke. On October 29th, a 50-46 vote, including 4 Republicans breaking ranks, passed a resolution to nullify Trump's tariffs on Canada. It was the first time in years that Congress openly challenged a sitting Republican president on trade. The message was clear: America cannot afford to antagonize its closest energy partner. Analysts from the German Marshall Fund called it the most significant crack in U.S. trade unity since the steel wars of 2018. Markets reacted instantly. Cameco shares rose 6%, while U.S. utilities like Exelon and Duke Energy saw short-term volatility. Behind the scenes, energy lobbyists rushed to reassure lawmakers that any disruption in uranium supply could push nuclear costs up by double digits. The White House remained defiant. Trump dismissed Ford's statement as the usual Canadian noise and hinted at new penalties for foreign energy imports. But his advisors were less certain. Internal briefs from the U.S. Department of Energy, leaked to Reuters, showed that Canada was still classified as a critical supplier of strategic minerals for defense and nuclear energy. The question no one wants to say out loud: what if Trump calls Ford's bluff and Ford isn't bluffing? For Canada, this isn't an easy threat to execute. Uranium is not oil. You can't just turn off a pipeline overnight. Cameco's production is tied to long-term contracts, and its shareholders, including major U.S. funds, would take a hit if exports stopped.
But politically, the symbolism works. It tells voters that Canada is no longer the passive partner in the relationship. It's an emotional message more than an economic one, and it landed in a moment when Canadian identity is shifting towards assertiveness.
Ford's approval rating jumped 6 points in Ontario after his speech. National polls showed that nearly 2/3 of Canadians support stronger retaliation measures against U.S. tariffs. That's unheard of in a country that built its modern economy on bilateral trade. But here's the paradox. The more Canada talks about independence, the more its own economy shows how intertwined it still is with America's. 3/4 of Canadian exports still cross south. Every time the US sneezes, Ottawa catches a cold. So to cut energy exports would mean risking its own jobs, revenues, and market credibility. Ford knows that, but he's also gambling on something else: timing. If Trump's tariffs cause economic pain during a US election cycle, Canada's threat could look like a master move, one that forces Washington to reconsider its aggression before winter energy demand peaks. And that sets up the real battle, not of steel or cars, but of energy security. When Ford drew his red line, it wasn't just about tariffs, it was about respect. Canada's long-standing role as America's dependable sidekick had quietly shifted over the last decade. It now controls minerals the US needs but doesn't have: uranium, potash, cobalt, and nickel, all essential for energy and defense. So when Ford threatened to weaponize those exports, it struck at something deeper than economics. It questioned who truly holds leverage in this so-called partnership.
Let's break down the numbers. Roughly 40% of all uranium processed in US reactors traces back to Canada, directly or through conversion plants tied to Cameco. Another 20% comes from Kazakhstan, and a small fraction from Australia. That means almost 2/3 of America's nuclear supply comes from allies or strategic partners, but only one of them shares a land border and integrated power grid. In 2025, uranium prices have surged past $100 per pound, the highest since 2007. The International Energy Agency reports that any further disruption could push it to $140, putting pressure on global electricity markets already strained by fuel costs. For the US, even a short-term cutoff would ripple across the Midwest, where reactors in Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio keep industrial cities alive during winter. And this is what makes Ford's timing so dangerous or brilliant. He's reminding Washington that Canada isn't just a friendly supplier. It's part of the circuitry of American life. Flip that switch, and lights go out in both countries. That's why the US Senate's 50-46 vote to overturn Trump's tariffs wasn't symbolic, it was survival. Lawmakers realized that an all-out trade war with Canada would backfire faster than any they fought before. The German Marshall Fund called it the first instance of economic self-defense within the American system. Yet the vote also exposed Trump's isolation. Inside his circle, hardliners argue that Canada's threats are hollow, that Ford can't risk collapsing his own mining sector. But moderates inside the Energy Department warn that betting on a bluff is reckless. If Ford even slows exports for a month, utilities would draw down emergency fuel reserves, prices for nuclear feedstock would jump, investors would panic, and confidence in North American energy stability would crack. Markets understand that fear. Futures data from CME already shows spikes every time Ottawa and Washington trade insults.
While Ford and Trump trade barbs, Saskatchewan's miners are running the real calculus. Cameco's production is booked years in advance, and every shock helps its profits. Wall Street sees the pattern too. Uranium ETFs are up 35% year to date. Investors don't care about rhetoric, they follow scarcity. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan, the world's top uranium producer, quietly ramps up output. Moscow's state firm Rosatom still owns part of the supply chain, meaning any Canadian disruption indirectly hands leverage to Russia. It's a paradox that Ford likely understands. To punish Trump, he might empower Putin. That's the cruel symmetry of global trade. Your enemy's problem can become your rival's advantage. Back home, Ford faces a split audience. Industry leaders warn him not to push too far. Saskatchewan Premier Mo, whose province produces most of the uranium, told CBC News, "You can't bluff with the livelihood of miners." But populist voters love Ford's defiance. After years of watching the US dominate negotiations, they want to see a Canadian leader stand tall. And so Ford walks the same tightrope every populist eventually faces: how to sound powerful without collapsing the very economy you're protecting. Behind closed doors, Canadian diplomats scramble to contain the rhetoric. They've quietly reassured Washington that no formal export block is planned yet. But even the threat has already done its job. It forced America's attention. The bigger picture is that Canada's resource diplomacy is maturing. What was once a polite dependency is turning into a form of economic deterrence. Uranium isn't just a fuel anymore, it's leverage.
Europe watches this feud nervously. The EU imports some Canadian uranium too, and any shift in North American flows could hit its decarbonization plans. Japan and South Korea, both heavily reliant on nuclear energy, have already started exploring backup supply lines through Australia. Meanwhile, China's state media paints Ford's move as proof that the West's energy solidarity is fracturing. Even the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna issued a brief note urging stability and predictability in uranium markets, a diplomatic way of saying don't play chicken with nuclear fuel. The real stress test arrives this winter. U.S. utilities begin refueling cycles in December, just as heating demand peaks. If political uncertainty keeps prices elevated, ratepayers will feel it by January. That's when Ford's gambit will be judged. Was it a smart bluff that forced Washington back to the table, or the spark that ignited a trade freeze neither side can control? The irony is striking. Canada built its wealth on being America's most reliable partner. The US built its confidence on never needing to fear that partner's wrath. Now, both nations are discovering how fragile that trust really is. If this standoff continues, there may be no winners, only lessons. That economic power, once weaponized, never feels the same again. That even friends can forget how interdependent they really are. And that one angry premier with a microphone can remind the world that energy isn't just fuel, it's fate.